Okay. Good evening, folks, and welcome. My name is Nick. I'm with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System in Maryland, just outside of DC. We're coming to you live tonight as part of our virtual program series, and we have a very special guest. His name is Matthew Quirk, and he is a New York Times bestselling author. Welcome, Matthew.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Totally. So this event is part of our ongoing virtual event series that we've been doing since the beginning of the COVID closure. And we've been very fortunate to have a bunch of great authors with us. And this month we have 5 different authors lined up. Matthew's kicking it off today. And then coming up, we have R. Eric Thomas, who wrote Here for It, and then also George Matthew Johnson, who wrote All Boys Aren't Blue for Pride Month. And we also have Christopher Bonner talking about remaking the Republic, which is very timely. And then we'll have Richard Bell coming back to talk about Hamilton and the musical as history later in the month. So we appreciate, Matthew, your joining us tonight. We have multi-streams going on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So if you're on any of those platforms, please go ahead and share those feeds so that others can tune in. And can you hear me, Matt?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Um,
If that person who can't hear, if you wouldn't mind refreshing your browser window or going to
can
one
you
of the
hear
other
me
platforms,
too?
I can hear you fine, and they can hear you
Yeah,
as well.
I'm wondering if our questioner there.
Could be a bandwidth thing, but if you're having trouble
Hmm.
on here, please go to YouTube or Facebook, and I can share that link for you here. But sometimes it's a bandwidth issue, but on my end, everything is all systems go. So anywho, format today will be an informal just discussion, fun chat about Matt's work and his new book, and then we'll have some audience Q&A. You can share your comments and questions at any time in the chat box here in Crowdcast or on any platform where you're watching, and we'll check all of those to get the questions. So a bit about Matt before we get totally underway here. So Matt studied history and literature, I believe it was, at Harvard College. He currently lives in San Diego, and he is the best-selling author of The Night Agent, The 500, Dead Man's Switch, Cold Barrel Zero, and The Directive. He previously worked at The Atlantic, where he covered crime, private military contractors, terrorism prosecutions, and international organized crime, which sounds like about as thrilling of a beat as you could possibly get as a journalist. Um, and his work has been widely praised as one of um, the hot new voices in thriller and conspiracy and mystery books. There's a great quote from David Baldacci, who is, of course, one of the great figures in this genre, who said of Matt's previous book, The Night Agent, that is one of the best thrillers to come along in years. And he's been compared to Harlan Coben, John Grisham, Lee Child, and Brad Thor, among many others. So Matt, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really honored to have you with us tonight, and especially given your new book, "The Hour of the Assassin," which is set in our area here in DC, albeit we're here in the burbs, but our world revolves around DC, so we feel like it was set in our hometown here.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the introduction.
Totally.
Yeah, and I lived in DC, and all the time at the Atlantic was in DC, and I go back and forth a lot for the books. And it's funny, I live out here now, but I spend most of my days in my head, kind of plotting out
Hmm.
stories in DC. So I was just writing a scene right now, set on Haynes Point, actually.
Oh, cool. Nice. So tonight's just totally low pressure conversation. We're going to get a bit into Matt's background as a writer, and then dive into Hour of the Assassin a bit more in depth. So, can you tell us about your origin story as a writer, and how you got interested in writing? Was it through reading? Was it when you were a kid? Was it later on in college?
Uh, yeah. I mean, it started as, being a lifelong reader and just reading all the time. And I started getting really serious about writing in college. One summer I just started writing at night, and like it was like a drug. I couldn't stop doing it, and I loved doing it. And I was fortunate to put together something and get into a seminar in college. And it was really funny because we did most of the academic writing is kind of literary realism, short story, and I was not good at it at all. So I love doing the fiction, and I kind of struggled with that. the sort of classic New Yorker short story. And then I was also doing the newspaper at school, and the Crimson at Harvard is just a great newspaper. And a lot of people who go through there, they're doing incredible work now, like, Dave Farenthold at the Washington Post and many, many more. And so through that, I was fortunate enough to get the job with the Atlantic, but I was really young. I was like an intern, and then I went there straight out of college. And it was a funny way back around to fiction because it was in the run up to the Iraq War. It was 2002, 2003, and there was so much cool intrigue in DC, because I would go out to drinks with a friend and at his house in Adams Morgan, there would be people who worked for Ahmed Chalabi, and they were like intriguing around the Capitol. And so I started getting more into politics and foreign affairs, which I really didn't know a lot about. Coming to DC, and I just got this great immersion in them through the Atlantic, and that got me going with fiction again. And I started putting, the kinds of things I would brush up against, reporting or meeting people, other reporters, into fiction. And it was really cool because I had, kind of grown up on lots of great stuff. My mom actually went back to school for an English degree when I was a kid, so we had the classics around, but also there was, James Patterson and John Grisham and Michael Crichton and Stephen King. So I sort of went back to that because there was so much great intrigue, and that's how I got onto thrillers and just started doing those kind of nights and weekends when I was working as a reporter. And then was really fortunate that I had sent one out, and then it was 2008, and I lost my job as a journalist. And right now that's happening, and it's really hard to see again. But I was really fortunate that I got good feedback on it, and ultimately sold the first book, The 500, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's awesome. Very cool. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Jersey,
Oh, cool.
which
What part?
has a lot of great writers from there.
Yeah, that's true. Northern Jersey or Philly area or
Kind
the
of the
shore?
central area, kind of near the coast, but not really a beach town. It's Middletown, near Red Bank, Middletown, New Jersey. If that's the dent in the side of New Jersey, we're right there, and then the
Cool.
beach is over here. Yeah.
Neat. Very cool.
So yeah, it was a great place to grow up.
Yeah.
We're about an hour outside of New York, so my mom's still there. She goes back and forth all the time, or did until the current situation.
Cool. How did you land on San Diego following the DC time?
Well, my wife had worked out here in politics in 2004,
Hmm.
and she just loved it. And we'd both been in DC for 8 or 10 years and kind of wanted a break. So we came here to try it out, and I was by then doing the books, so I could kind of work from anywhere. And yeah, we've been trying it out for, I don't know, it's a long time now, maybe 8 years. It's a very timeless place. I mean, there are
Yeah.
seasons, but it's not it just seems time flies by out here. So it's inspired some books. I actually got to know some special operations people out here,
Hmm.
which kind of really opened up what I was felt comfortable writing about, getting to know them. And that's I brought that back to the DC conspiracy thrillers I started out with,
Hmm.
to have people who might have more of a official background or military background or intelligence background.
Cool. What has kind of been your experience with the transition from the journalistic writing and the nonfiction writing to very different genre and very different pacing? Or is there a difference in the way that you have to pace in the two different formats?
Well, I mean, I was lucky to do magazine stuff where you can you hook people, and I was always really interested in the hook. And we had time to make things, to spend a lot of time on the prose in a way you wouldn't in, say, daily journalism.
Mhm.
And so they're very different. I mean, the hardest thing about novel writing is just the pure invention of it. in that, there's not a topic, there's not, you just have to come up with the entire story instead of having, a subject at hand, and it's pretty clear where you go with it. Although, in magazine journalism, it's, you could kind of write about anything. So there was a similar wide open slate. So actually, the habit of collecting ideas and finding things that will be intriguing, um, I picked up while doing magazine stuff and
Hmm.
having a big idea file. And the most valuable thing that translated from magazines to the books was probably the kind of the rejection and the
Hmm.
toughness of being the young person at the Atlantic, because it's such a great magazine, has such an incredible staff, and I would pitch like 100 ideas a year and get rejected on 99.
Wow.
And so you just learn to be pretty ruthless, and that's valuable when you come to write a book, because when you have a premise for a book, it's really good to have a solid premise from the get-go and an intriguing premise from the get-go. So I try to be my own editor and be as tough on myself as the editors were on me, which I really appreciate. And also just writing professionally for a while, you get rid of a lot of the preciousness that can kind of like slow you down when you first start doing fiction, and you learn how to just get words on the page and kind of fix them later. So it was good to write for publication for a few years before I got into fiction, because it can be
Hmm.
really paralyzing for beginning writers to think like, oh no, this is committing words to the page. So it's good to get through that.
Hmm. You mentioned writing for the Crimson, and uh, would you mind explaining what that is to folks who might not be familiar with the newspaper?
Oh, sure. So it's the Harvard College newspaper, and Harvard doesn't have a journalism department. It just has this really good newspaper. And the people there go on to work at, the New York Times and the Washington Post and all these other great places. And it's always fun to pick up the newspaper and see what these people and worked with are doing. And it's really a professionally run paper, because
Hmm.
I mean, everyone there is like a super A type, and they do a great job. And it's kind of funny because it's such a professional place that the people who are working as like the managing editor and the president of
Hmm.
it, I was like uh, kind of mid-tier editor there, because I couldn't. They spend 70 or 80 hours a week at the paper,
Uh,
and they're falling apart, and they're in
yeah.
college, and some of them are pre-med too.
Oh boy.
um, and so it's really funny because they're the smartest people in the world. They're producing this great paper, and they're like, some of them are borderline about to fail out of Harvard because they're just
Wow.
at the newspaper so much, because they take turns. But you put the newspaper to bed if you're in charge of the publishing cycle. You're there till 4 a.m.
Uh,
and you do that once a week. So it's a great professional paper, and somebody who was a better kind of networker than I was connected with the new owner of the Atlantic, and he came up and talked to some of us, and I was kind of fortunate to through that to get an internship there.
awesome. What were some of the skills that you refined during that time at the Crimson that have served you both in the time as a journalist and now with fiction writing?
Boy, I had terrible work habits in college, just terrible. So there are not much. It was the time at the Atlantic where I learned how to kind of sit and write during the day, and to look at the world and say, oh, that's an interesting topic to dive in on, and here's a good scope for a story. And those really translated well to novel writing. But the whole novel writing game is very strange, because it's a lot like college,
Hmm.
in that you have a lot of unstructured time, or, it was similar to my very fortunate experience of time where I had a lot of unstructured time. And it's really up to you to, have good work habits and things like that. And in college, I was terrible. I was up till like 2 or 4 in the morning. I was pulling all-nighters. So it's, I've been out of college for 18 years, and every year I get a little bit better at just sitting down to write like it's a normal job.
Mhm.
Because, novel writing, it's very strange, and it's hard to just sit down and write for, 5 or 6 hours every day. And it's really a psychological game.
Mhm.
That's kind of the hardest part of it.
Cool. How has your writing evolved from your debut novel to Hour of the Assassin?
Oh, that's interesting. I think I think I've kind of calmed down on trying to show off and be like really tricky, um, and to kind of rely on the story itself to pull people along. So I would, try to have a lot of twists, or I would drop people into the middle of the scene, or I would, fake people out a lot. And I think I've done those less and less. So, and I also, over time switched from uh, first person to third person, which was just a great moment for me in writing, because if you're writing suspense novels, third person is like getting the keys to the car. And
Hmm.
it's so simple because you can just show the guy sneaking up behind the other guy, and that's where all the suspense comes from. So,
Hmm.
that, and getting more comfortable just diving into a world where, the Hour of the Assassin is former Secret Service people, and the Night Agent is in the Situation Room. And you have to have a certain confidence in your research and your writing to say, I'm just going to dive into this world, and the president's going to walk in, and the national security advisor walk in, and I can make it credible. So that's something that really comes with confidence over the years, and that's kind of the reason the first books were more of a young outsider, because that's kind of matched up to me being a young guy in DC and
Hmm.
exposed to all these institutions and these kind of these very impressive places and institutions. And over time, I felt more comfortable diving into those.
Hmm. Cool. Where did you live in DC when you were here?
I lived in DuPont Circle above the gas station.
Okay.
Yeah, it was like the
Cool.
last affordable-ish studio in DuPont Circle. And
Nice.
yeah, I would hear those gas trucks coming in all the time, get a little buzz. Um, and then I lived on like New Hampshire, right at the bottom of Meridian Hill, Malcolm X Park.
Uh-huh.
And then that was pretty much it. Yeah. And then I
Neat.
briefly lived in Delray and briefly in Silver Spring.
Hmm.
And
Very
and
cool.
I never had a car, which is really funny. So I my DC geography and knowledge, I shouldn't bust myself like this, is very, very local and very detailed on, the 15 blocks around that area. But I don't even know Capitol Hill that well.
Mm.
So I found myself, every time I go back, exploring a little bit more, because yeah, I had a very walkable, bikeable knowledge of DC.
Hmm. Cool. So let's shift over to your new book, Hour of the Assassin. So here's another Baldacci quote for everyone. The other Baldacci quote is, Quirk has earned his spot in the front ranks of thriller writers. Opens with a bang and keeps exploding for 300 pages. This is with regard to Hour of the Assassin. And I could not agree more with that kind of sense of energy from
Oh,
the
thanks.
moment that the book opens. You're in the thick of it, and you don't necessarily know what's going on yet, but the that kind of pace and uh, feeling of excitedness really, it started high and just it soared all the way to the end, and towards the end it was just like, what, which I love in my reading of thrillers. So, would you mind giving us a bit of an overview of the plot?
Sure. And then I would tell anybody who hasn't read it to cover their ears for the next like 10 seconds because there's a couple very tricky things at the very beginning of the book that are even given away by if you read the jacket copy. But you have a former Secret Service agent who gets framed for a very high profile murder in DC and has to go on the run to clear his name. And at the same time, you have some very powerful politicians. And what's more interesting to me, sort of the forces behind politicians that in some cases you can think of them as kind of pulling the strings. And what is a relatively realistic portrayal. You have them building up a conspiracy and sort of working against our Secret Service agent on the run. And the stakes for them are being able to get somebody into the Oval Office and to, get him there and keep him there by any means necessary.
Cool. And there's so much more to it, so everyone's got to read it. That's my pitch to everyone.
Yeah. And the hook and the cool real world thing that brought me into this book, which is often how I get into the book, is that the Secret Service agent, his current job is that he poses as an assassin to break into places and does kind of mock assassinations to test security, which is essentially a real job in DC. And once I found out about that, I was like, okay, that's a book. And so that's kind of the setup for a book. What if you're a mock assassin and then suddenly there's a real assassination? And of course, the blame falls on you and you're off to the races.
Cool. So how did you end up learning more about that role as it exists in terms of testing security plans to see where the vulnerabilities are?
It was funny. It kind of was like two branches that came together. And one was researching previous novels. You are always having to write these crazy situations in books. And it's like, okay, for the next scene, my main character needs to break into the Department of Justice to steal back some papers. And then you, as a novelist, you're like, well, how's that going to work? And you can use cliches from other books and movies, but I do a ton of research, and I actually found a branch of the GAO, which is the Government Accounting Office or Accountability Office. It used to be the Government Auditing Office. It's the most boring, or seems to be the most boring agency in DC. But they actually do this security testing, and they send people with explosives to see if they can like plant an explosives in the suite of the Secretary of Defense in real life. And they use real explosives. They're not like wired up properly. It's a very like low concentration. It couldn't go off, but they want something that would set off like a dog or a sensor, and they do it. And I was just spending all this time Googling, and I found a write-up they had, and I was like, holy cow, this is actually how you would get into these agencies. And it was cool. It was, you can buy black market replica police badges. Wow. And with them, I mean, you can get in, that's how they get in anywhere. It was crazy. So I put that in a book, and it was cooler and more realistic than crawling through the air duct, which is kind of the joke cliche you do and everything. So, and then the other aspect was, there was a lot of lock picking because I had a former thief in the first couple of books. So I talked to, I had to find people who do this, and they actually do this sort of security testing work. And so I got to know them, and they helped me with some books. And I was kind of fascinated because they do these trial runs where they like leave something in the safe to say, I gotcha.
Wow. Cool. While GAO it's kind of like the quintessential federal government thing. When you're on the other end of a negative report from GAO, it sets off frenzy. I used to be in the federal government, and I've seen some of that happen, and
Oh
it's
yeah,
like if you want
yeah.
to see a civil service fed kind of freaking out, that's a GAO report will do it.
And I struggle with that all the time because that, I mean, that is like high stakes,
Hmm.
the most serious thing that could happen in federal government. But like, and it's why it's nice to write from San Diego sometimes. I have to have distance to be like, but what if a dead body showed up in the, old Capitol baths? So, I mean, it's there's a really funny tension between like the very realistic high stakes in DC of day-to-day life that's ultra realistic, and then
Hmm.
some of the elements of thrillers which, well, they used to feel very very
Yeah,
far-fetched,
yeah,
but now we're living in the world's craziest novel,
yeah.
so unfortunately
That's,
it's closer to reality than it has been.
yeah, that's a very good phrase to describe it. The world's craziest. Yeah. Um, so along those lines, since the can of worms opened, so much of this type of book can be connected to current events or things that happen in society or the tropes of what's going on in terms of government conspiracies and things like that. And I think also a lot of those themes are recurrent in our history as a country. And for example, another recent DC conspiracy novel that I read was the Jake Tapper The Hellfire Club, which
Oh,
gets
I didn't
into
read
some
that
of
yet.
the similar kind of DC government people that control the strings and then the conspiracies and all that stuff. Um, how does your approach consider these historical tropes, or do you just kind of go away from that and just think of it as what's the good story in this time and setting?
Hmm. Well, I don't spend a lot of time. Well, I do a little bit, thinking about sort of the history of, more specifically, the conspiracy genre in books and film,
Hmm.
and so for the last couple of books, they've been conspiracy thrillers, and it seems like, uh, I mean, and the today's events kind of underscore that we're in this incredible time of there's so many difficult things the country is facing, and even before that I just felt like we were kind of in a throwback to the 70s, where there was sort of a loss of faith in government. There was and there were some great stories that came out of that kind of post Watergate moment, and so in the last couple of books I've been harking back to some of those like great 70s conspiracy thrillers, like Parallax View, or 6 Days of the Condor / 3 Days of the Condor. So I definitely think about kind of the history of the genre in that way. And and it's tricky. It's really tricky because um, I was a journalist, and in real life, day to day, I hate conspiracies, and I don't like conspiracy
Hmm.
theories. And I think they erode people's faith that they can make a difference. And I think they sort of draw people's attention toward imaginary causes of problems that maybe are comforting because they're easier to understand, and draws attention away from like the real, more difficult kind of structural causes of problems. So, um, as a journalist, I don't want people, or former journalist, I don't want people believing in conspiracies that like one evil guy is behind everything. And on the other hand, as a novelist and entertainer, there's something that I love about this genre and the stories. So, I mean, the first thing I do is just say like, this is a book, and it's not real. But I also try to, while hitting the main elements of a conspiracy thriller, to get pieces in that point to um, what to call them, like the real conspiracies, which would be, for instance, money in politics. which can feel like a total conspiracy, except everybody knows about it.
Hmm.
So in Hour of the Assassin, there's a lot of attention to, money in politics and how dependent politicians are on fundraisers and the influence of, dark money and the astounding amounts of money that individuals and small groups can put into elections. And so that is something I like to look for turf like that, where it feels like a conspiracy, but it's a very real problem. And to, tell a good juicy yarn, but at the same time, hopefully draw some attention to a real issue. And the other piece in Hour of the Assassin is how powerful men get away with horrible stuff for decades and decades because there's kind of a conspiracy of silence
Hmm.
around them, and because they have these like armies of kind of complicit professionals, either in banking and accounting trades or in law, who can help them bury stories or hide money. So that was another thing where that's kind of conspiracy terrain, but it's a real thing. So that's
Hmm.
a story I like to tell to hopefully draw some attention there.
Cool. With that specific plot line, without getting into the spoilers, were there any specific instances in our recent history, or even going back several decades, that that are real life cases of bad things happening to people that are then covered up, that inspired that, or did you just kind of take the theme and make it your own? I,
Uh,
I know this is hard to
no,
talk about without
it was
spoilers.
inspired by, Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein and these things where like people knew Jeffrey Epstein was a creep for decades, like
Hmm.
a I shouldn't say creep because that sort of softens it, like a criminal for decades, but he could get out of it because of influence. And then, seeing the kind of Trump National Enquirer, Michael Cohen, the payoffs and the way even kind of high-end lawyers were involved in these very strange deals where you would sort of represent someone and you couldn't tell if you were getting a settlement for them and a nonprofit dedicated to a cause, or if it
Mm.
was, or if they were facilitating a payoff.
Yep.
And it was just this incredible spooky gray area with very legit, well-known DC attorneys, who are like very upstanding people.
Hmm.
So all of that coming out into the open was really fascinating me. I mean, like National Enquirer literally had a vault of secrets,
Wow.
and people would say like, "What's in the safe?" I forget the guy's name. I think his name was his name Pecker?
I'm
It
not
feels
sure.
like I'm saying something weird on video. But he literally had a vault of secrets, and
Mm.
and this happens with TMZ too, and then you can kind of
Hmm.
use that to trade for access or to get political favor. So it was one of these elements of a conspiracy thriller. Like that was the whole plot of my first book, was about blackmailing everyone in DC, and then and that felt over the top when I wrote it in relatively boring times. And then now I'm just reading the newspaper and there's payoffs and there's blackmail material and there's talk of whether the president's compromised by Russia. So yeah, unfortunately, the my far out conspiracy theories, conspiracy novels are seem less over the top every
Mm.
day.
Yeah.
It's really
It
sad.
The name was David Pecker officially. I checked that
Yes.
for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and on that point about the conspiracies, it's very much been a bipartisan thing historically. That everyone, both sides have played those kind of games with money and control and um, influence and shell organizations, and it's not a new thing at all. And it's and Nixon, of course, is a big one. Um, the one thing with Nixon that was new to me more recently when I watched the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary was what he was doing before he was in office, to mess with the election and the continuation of the warfare.
Oh,
Um,
the peace talks,
yeah,
kind of
and
sabotaging.
going
Yeah.
yeah. And I
Yeah.
was like, I hadn't learned that in history class growing up, and it
Yeah.
was
And
pretty
that's such a
pretty awesome.
great like thriller thing where
Yeah.
you're treating with these people on the side.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. So one thing I just want to ask that's kind of random, but what made you select Shaw as the neighborhood where Nick is based in the book?
Oh, this is really fun. I had a friend, Tom Lee, who worked for a bunch of different tech things in Shaw, and they were in like old converted garages. And more generally, when I would just kind of wander around DC brainstorming, I would just fall into these alley networks, and they're so cool. And I didn't actually get to visit the Shaw ones until more recently.
Hmm.
But there's some in DuPont Circle too.
Hmm.
Um, and there's a really neat history and kind of a sad history. I might be getting this wrong, where like kind of I think African Americans coming to DC were sort of forced to live not on the main streets but in the alleys.
Oh, wow.
I can't. I remember reading that like in a book a long time ago, but so it's just this kind of interesting DC world, and the idea of having a cool shop in a converted carriage house in Shaw on kind of a hidden alley was really cool to me, because
Hmm.
this friend of mine is also like a big tech guy, and if I need to know how to like program a thing to get into a door, like happens in the opening scene, he's like, "Oh, you do this and you do this."
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so he was working for some tech people in some tech companies in Shaw, and I just thought it was a cool, piece of DC history, and have fun poking around back there. But now they're like, incredibly, incredibly upscale. So it's kind of funny.
Hmm.
Yeah, I went.
Yeah.
I was cruising around in there, and I saw some workmen putting like the finishing touches on converting some warehouse, and I was like, "What's going in here?" And he said, "Peruvian yakitori," and I was like, "Okay, we have reached like peak yuppie Shaw."
Oh, yeah. Cool. I used to live in Shaw before I came out here to Prince
Oh,
George's
cool.
County. So I the first book that I've read recently that's a new book that has any kind of interaction with the neighborhood, which is cool because it's such a the way that neighborhood has changed, and it for better and for worse. But it's been such a kind of bellwether neighborhood in terms of its evolution and what's happening in the city, whether it's with the gentrification or when we had the riot, '68.
Oh,
The
Nick, you buffered a little bit there, so I'll just wait for you to come back.
Sure. Hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I think everyone's Wi-Fi is
Oh
below.
yeah, we're all maxed out.
It's curious to hear uh, personal relationships in the. There were a lot of really interesting relationships between Nick, the protagonist, and his assistant, who was a refugee, I believe. Really. And then also his relationship with his wife and the relationship with his ex, who kind of plays into the plot at a certain point. And then also there's the other folks on the not good people side or in between, who have very long-term relationships that are.
Oh, Nick, we're losing you.
Oh no! I'll type
It's
it into the
okay.
chat if you.
It sounded a little
uh,
Tron for a minute.
that's funny
But I
about
heard you
the.
describing the relationships. Yeah, you seem to be okay on audio. Oh, okay. The personal relationships and how they evolve in the book. Um, yeah, it's how do they evolve? Yeah. In this one, it was really sometimes you can map them out in a novel in advance and be very deliberate to say, I want this person to be a foil. This person will demonstrate, the dark side of the character, and this person will draw out the good side, and this person will remind them of what they stand for. But this one was very just kind of came together. Delia, I was just writing a scene, and I was like, I just jumped in at the beginning of the book, and I was like, oh, this guy needs some buddies. So I wrote some buddies at the bar. And yeah, and he's such a bold person, that I thought of having somebody who would be a foil to him, somebody who would be a little bit more cautious and for whom, becoming bold would be a bit more of an arc. And my wife just went to grad school at SAIS, and we met all these incredibly cool people. And one of them was an Iraqi American woman named Delia. So I was like, I love Delia. Let's put her in the book. A very different story, and Delia works in the Senate and isn't like a tech genius, but just very organic how that came together. Yeah, and Nick and his wife, it's something where you can have a tension where you have two people and you sort of want them to get back together, and there's mistrust, and those are all the fun elements of a thriller where the person you would go to for solace may be a person um, who you can't trust. But that's also a very tricky thing when you're writing these, because you don't want your hero to not have good judgment, and you don't want somebody to get betrayed by someone that close. But when that does happen, it really packs a punch. So that's kind of how you use those marriage relationships. Yeah, so bits and pieces of real people, but it's a lot of just like muddling through in these novels. And even when I start with a plan, but sometimes halfway through, like in battle, they say the enemy gets a say when you're battle planning, and the book gets a say. So you could have a great outline and be halfway through and be like, none of these people would do what I
Oh
thought I
no.
wanted them to do, and now they're in charge.
Cool. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just let me know if you can't, and I'll refresh my audio while you're talking. The next question. Um, so picking up on that thread that you just ended with, were there any surprises that happened in the writing of the book that changed the course?
Well, I mean, yeah. I actually wrote a very different first draft of this book where and it's kind of fascinating to me how you can rework a book. So my first draft of this book, Nick, instead of looking for a missing ex, was looking for his missing daughter.
Hmm.
And it was a totally different story and had a big twist. Um, and this happens sometimes. The twist did not work.
Oh.
And I built the entire book around the twist so that at the end you would just be weeping,
Uh-huh.
and it didn't work. And people were like, yay. And so I had to rework the book. And so the daughter came out, and that had been a big part of the, issues with the relationship. And it's just writing. It can be
Mhm.
a real crazy roller coaster. So, first you think, oh man, if I take out a central thread of this book, the whole thing's going to fall apart. And then you can kind of take the bits and pieces and say, oh, well, this would work with a completely different plot in the middle. And then, add elements. And it's really surprising, how you could break it out into these, sometimes modular parts.
Mhm.
So yeah, this one was a super duper heavy rewrite. And yeah, and I really had a lot of surprises for me, certainly.
Yeah.
Because, I go in with a very deliberate plan, everything's balanced, and I spend weeks, um, you know, crafting them. And so to have something that you have to rewrite on the fly on a deadline can be really scary. So
Mhm.
yeah, so I just jumped in, and yeah,
Cool.
came together, and I mean, some people seem to be enjoying it, so I'm
Yeah.
relieved.
Neat. Um, Loyalty has a big role in this story, and the way that connects to relationships and how things change. Uh, were you intentional about the way that loyalty appeared in the different relationship dynamics, or did it just kind of happen naturally with the way that the plot was going?
I mean, most everything in this book, because I was just kind of like rewriting and getting into more seat of the pants, which is how a lot of people write, especially as I was, reworking everything. Most of that sort of developed organically.
Mhm.
Um, and I was tweaking things, and it was a really interesting exercise for me as an outliner. These are the two big schools in in novel writing, the pantsers who write by the seat of their pants,
Hmm.
and the outliners who outline. So when you take an outliner and then say you have to pants the rest of this, it can be really interesting.
Yeah.
But by that point, it's really neat because you have your whole manuscript, and the beauty of it for an author is that we can look at the whole thing and we can go back in time to fix something back there to set up something over here.
Hmm.
So at that point, you sort of think of like a painting where you can kind of smudge this and smudge
Hmm.
this, and so it's interesting composition, but usually it turns into chaos at some point.
Oh, cool. So at this point, we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. So if anyone has questions, wherever you're watching, just let us know in the chat or comment boxes on your platform, and we'll share them with Matt. The first question was put in a while earlier by Julie, who asks, "Will there be a sequel to one or any of the characters?"
Is if this is Julie Riley, hey, great to hear from you. She's a friend's mother and a great fan. And
Oh, cool. Hi, Julie.
yeah. So and a shout out to her son Cornell too. I didn't get to see my DC people on this tour. So this is planned as a standalone. And yeah, I like to do that with these. The last couple books have been inspired by real life DC people. Like the Night Agent was a friend of mine who was kind of worked an all night desk in the intelligence community. And, there's something so nice about somebody having a really strong hook at the beginning of a book, and, ideally, um, being able to take somebody on through a story where, it's so life and death and so high stakes, and sort of deals with something that is, hopefully it's been haunting them their whole life, that it could only happen once. And I really like to do that. So I have been enjoying the standalones recently, because you have a lot of freedom in a way that you don't with a recurring character. I enjoy those too. But your protagonist can die, or halfway through you can find out he's the bad guy. So I've been enjoying the freedom of the standalones recently.
Cool. When you went into those other books with that ended up with the multiples, had you intended that from the get-go, like the way that this is a standalone?
No, and that as just a matter of kind of planning them out is really tricky too, because suddenly, like in the 500, this is a minor spoiler for like a 10-year-old book, so earmuffs if you're not interested. But I killed off the father, and that's I was reading all these like screenwriting books on how to structure a story, and what you do is you bring your hero all the way down, and you like take what's most precious, and that's what all the narrative theory says to do. And I did it, and it was so sad. Everybody said that's
Oh,
way too sad. You can't kill him. And I said, but I'm taking my character all the way down before he's trying. And they said, no, you're breaking my heart. So I brought the dad back. And then suddenly I had like the dad, I had the fiance, I had, and it's a lot of balls to keep in the air. And so that hadn't been planned as a series. And, I kept it going. And a lot of people have done incredible series, just riffing off a book that they thought would be a standalone. Like Daniel Silva had only planned one Gabriel Allon book, but I found it very challenging. And I wrote two kind of mini series where there's two books for each character. Like my first two books were the same guy. My second two books were the same guy, and it was really nice because I had more to tell and a natural kind of second story. And then I also was like pretty happy with where I left them. So I'm pretty fortunate. But I think if I do another series, it's going to be a little bit more deliberate from the get-go.
cool. So as an author, what did it do to your experience with this book versus your other books, with the fact that it was selected for Book of the Month Club? How did that kind of impact your whole world in the promotion of the book?
Oh, it was great, especially because this book came out in the middle of the COVID lockdowns. So book of the month is just a huge boost. So it helped us get the book in front of a lot more people, and it was great. My publisher